So today we will talk about a very important variable concerning homeostasis. It is a homeostatic variable, and that is electrolyte balance. And a deficiency in the serum level of any particular electrolyte, or an excess in the amount of any particular electrolyte in the amount of milliequivalent per liter or millimolar per liter, there is a conserved amount of each particular electrolyte in the body, whether sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, or phosphate. They must be present in the blood within a tolerable range. A deficiency within a tolerable range in units of millimolar per liter or milliequivalent per liter. A deficiency in each respective amount of each electrolyte leads to clinical exacerbations. That's the first point. Second point is, we must have a brief general understanding of homeostasis. It is the optimal form, it is the state in which the internal environment that is situated within the organism is kept constant. Kept constant in the sense that we have in this illustration over here, we have this green range, and we'll call this range the homeostatic range. And there are many variables that homeostasis is concerned with. A deviation or a decrease or an increase in the amount, in the tolerable amount of that particular variable leads to cell stress and further cell injury, cell death, and potentially inflammation. So one variable is temperature, as we have here, degrees Celsius. That's a variable. An overt increase in the temperature leads to hyperthermia. A decrease in the lowest tolerable temperature leads to hypothermia. There's pH, that's another variable. An increase in pH above the highest acceptable tolerable limit leads to alkalosis. A decrease of pH below the lowest tolerable minimal acceptable pH limit, and that is usually 7.39, and the highest acceptable limit is 7.4. So above the limit leads to alkalosis, below the limit, acceptable limit leads to acidosis, and there are many other variables. There is blood sugar level, above which there will be hyperglycemia. Below the lowest tolerable limit, we will have hypoglycemia. Blood pressure is an example of another variable. Above the highest tolerable limit, we will have hypertension. Below the lowest tolerable limit, we will have hypotension. And we will talk about them in the right time. But for today, we will talk about electrolyte balance. So above, there is, for each particular electrolyte, for potassium, sodium, calcium, magnesium, and phosphate, an increase in the highest acceptable amount in millimolar per liter, also known as milliequivalent per liter, and the lowest amount of millimolars per liter or milliequivalents per liter of that particular electrolyte will lead to either For example, sodium hypernatremia, potassium hyperkalemia, calcium hypercalcemia, phosphate hyperphosphatemia, or magnesium hypermagnesemia. And the opposite, if there is a drop below the least or the lowest possible acceptable millimolar per liter or milliequivalent per liter of that in the concentration of that particular electrolyte in the blood will lead to hypo, for sodium hyponatremia, for potassium hypocalcemia, for magnesium hypomagnesemia, and so on. So that's the first point. The second point, as I have here, this is the, in this illustration, this is the green homeostatic range that the cell is working very hard and fighting through adaptive mechanisms. These adaptive mechanisms will try to bring back the variables into this green homeostatic range. Many times, these adaptive mechanisms succeed to revert and bring back the drop, bring it back to the normal homeostatic range, or bring down that overt increase down into the reasonable tolerable range. And sometimes the adaptive mechanisms fail. There are factors that determine whether these adaptive mechanisms will succeed, and these factors depend on the stressor we're looking at, the intensity of the stressor, the duration of the stressor, and it also depends on the cell or the system we're looking at. Another point that is very important, and that is once we go below the normal tolerable limit, the cell will enter this zone that I put in yellow. It's the zone of warning. If it fails, these mechanisms fail, these adaptive mechanisms fail, we will go into the red zone. And that will dictate that the cell will die either by apoptosis or necrosis, depending on other factors. And the same thing is for the increase, the overt increase, or the overt decrease. These adaptive mechanisms, another very important point, irrespective of which variable we're looking at, blood pressure, glucose level, iron level, electrolyte levels, or temperature or pH, there will always be three components. There will always be component number one, and that is the sensor, also known as the detector or the receptor. And there will always be the second component, and that is the processing center. And there will always be the effector that will carry out that will successfully carry out the process of bringing back the cell or bringing back the change in the variable, whether increase or decrease, bring it back into the normal green acceptable range. Okay. Another point that I also want to say is that there are some variables, there are some systems, some adaptive mechanisms and reflexes that manage more than one variable. So it doesn't have to be for every variable there is one system. One system can even deal with two variables, such as the system of renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which we will talk about in the right time. Another very important point that must be mentioned is okay, so let's just give very brief example before we talk about the electrolyte imbalance of hyperglycemia. If there is an increase in the hyperglycemia, it will be sensed by, if there's an increase in blood glucose level, the sensor in this particular variable will be the pancreas, namely the beta cells of the pancreas, and they will process and secrete glucose, and the effector will be the skeletal muscle cell or the liver cells, and they will uptake glucose from the blood and decrease the amount of glucose in the blood, returning the overall amount into the green zone or the homeostatic range. And also it's very important for pH, and that is if there is an overt increase in the amount of hydrogen protons in the blood, there will be a compensatory mechanism where either if there is an increase in hydrogen protons in the blood, the cell will uptake and try to alleviate this burden of increased hydrogen protons in the blood and will take it from the blood into the cell. And in cases of there is an overt decrease of hydrogen protons or alkalosis in the blood, what will happen is the cell will compensate by sending and bringing out the hydrogen protons flowing from an area of higher hydrogen proton concentration into an area of lower hydrogen proton concentration, as we will see. Okay, another very important point to be mentioned, and that is electrolytes are very important for fluid balance. The cell is very important for fluid balance. In a macro level, the cell is important, the electrolytes are important for the heart, the neurons, and the skeletal muscles, because we need the electrolytes in order to carry out the electrical signals. And the processes of skeletal muscle or cardiac muscle depolarization leading to contraction is managed by these electrolytes. So a deviation, whether excess or deficiency, will cause either muscle twitchiness or a difficulty and pain in triggering the activity of contracting the muscles. So as we see, let's assume that this is the plasma cellular membrane. There is an electrolyte gradient where sodium is highest on extracellularly and potassium is the highest intracellular electrolyte, and sodium is the highest extracellular electrolyte. So we must have an understanding of what is intracellular versus extracellular. So in the body we will have two compartments. There is the intracellular compartment, intracellular fluid. And that is very clear inside the cell. So this is a cell, and the intracellular fluid is inside the cell. And then we have the extracellular fluid, meaning outside of the cell. And this is divided in two, this is itself divided in two zones, extracellular fluid. Now, the extracellular fluid compartment is divided into two very important zones, and that is the interstitial fluid, and then we'll have the plasma in the blood vessels. So we have plasma and these blood vessels, and we also have the extracellular or the interstitial space. So this is the interstitial space, and this is the blood vessels. So the interstitial space plus the plasma in the blood vessels will give us the extracellular fluid, while the intracellular fluid remains inside of the cell. The extracellular fluid is the compartment that sacrifices in times of overt increase in the temperature, where the body starts sweating to compensate and decrease and to decrease the temperature that is in the core, or the temperature that is striking the body by creating this sweat. Sweat is majorly comprised of water. This water, is it taken from the interstitial space? Is it taken from the intercellular space or the extracellular space? It is definitely taken from the extracellular space. Another point is, the body is 60% water. However, this 60% water is divided as follows: 40% water inside the cell and 20% water divided between the interstitial space and the plasma. So there's definitely more water inside the cell than outside the cell. Our electrolytes affect the amount of water presented either inside the cell or outside the cell. If there is an increase of a particular solute outside of the cell or a particular electrolyte, the water will try to compensate by moving from an area of a higher solute or a higher electrolyte concentration to an area of a lower electrolyte or solute concentration. Okay, so now we also must have a good understanding of what's an electrolyte. An electrolyte is a substance that broke off a compound. So we have a compound like sodium chloride. When this compound was put in a solvent like water, which is a very versatile solvent that will dissolve many different compounds with different properties. When a compound is put in water and is dissolved, this electrolyte will break into cations and anions. So in the case of sodium chloride, when put in water, it will break off into sodium with a positive charge and chloride with a negative charge. The sodium is called cation in this situation, bearing a positive charge, while chloride is called an anion, bearing a negative charge. An electrolyte with a positive charge means it has an electrolyte will always have a disturbance in the distribution of positive and negative charges within. So it's unstable. An electrolyte is unstable because it has a disturbance and inequality in the presence of electrons versus protons. So there will be more protons than electrons if we are a cation. So in the case of a cation, it bears a positive charge because it has more protons than electrons. While chloride ion will have a negative charge because it has more electrons than protons. So if we have a solution in which electrolytes are dissolved and separated bearing positive and negative charges, and we apply an electric field, then electricity will be transferred through these electrolytes, going from an area of highest electron concentration to area of lower electron concentration. So this is an understanding that will help us as we go into more detail about which of the electrolytes and their change in the homeostatic range and how will it affect the body. You must remember that these electrolytes, they broke off of compounds because they were dissolved, and they were dissolved in a solvent. They are solutes that dissolved in a solvent. They separated, broke off into cations bearing positive charges because more protons than electrons, and anions bearing negative charge because they possess more electrons than protons, and the body will have homeostatic mechanisms that will sense, process, and send effector signals that will reverse the change, whether an increase, overt increase, or overt decrease, and bring back the cell into the state of homeostasis. So now let's talk about these different electrolytes, being potassium, sodium, calcium, which are the major electrolytes, and magnesium and phosphate.